3. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the latest Truth and Consequences Zoomcast. And I am really thrilled today to be joined by Anthony Fisher, who writes a columnist at the Business Insider. He's worked at a host of news outlets across media landscape over the past decade or so, I think. Is that correct?
11 years.
11 years, okay. He's a great columnist, and I'll tell you a funny thing about Anthony. It's one of the reasons why I like him a lot. Every once in a while, he'll send me, or I'll send him a piece and say, hey, I wrote this, that'll be interesting to you. And he's like, oh, I wrote something about that a few days ago. I'm like, oh, okay. And then he'll send me a piece like he did today about vaccine mandates. And I'll say, hey, I wrote a piece like that. It hasn't come out yet, unfortunately. I'm not sure what the holdup is, but it should be out hopefully today. So we are kind of have a bit of a mind meld these days, even though we come from very different sort of, I think, political backgrounds, as Anthony is a lapsed libertarian. But I do want to talk about vaccine mandates because this has been on my mind a lot recently. And you wrote a piece today basically arguing it's time to sort of consider doing mandates. But I like the point that you made, which is to say that we have to differentiate between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated and stop catering to the unvaccinated. So you can talk a little bit about that. Anthony?
Sure, and
okay, yeah,
and just to be clear, when you use the word mandate and also lapsed libertarian, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, you're good.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay, all right. Sorry, there's a lag there.
Okay.
Yeah, so to be clear, when I'm talking about mandates, I make it very clear in the article that I oppose government mandates, that I oppose legalizing, like making it like the way it's being done in France right now, where the government says you cannot go into a private business unless you're vaccinated. I feel like that is too far. But what I was hoping for is, on a widespread basis, private businesses voluntarily adopting policies that require, for the use of indoor facilities, vaccination. So even if you wanted to go to a restaurant and sit outdoors, okay, you're not indoors, but out. But indoors, I think private businesses can and should be requiring proof of vaccination because that's where the virus is spreading. The virus isn't spreading, on playgrounds. It's not spreading in schools. It's
right.
spreading in indoor locations where people speak loudly and to each other. And we've learned this. We in the first few months of the pandemic, we didn't learn this, but it's people, in closed areas, issuing lots of viral loads and someone being there for long enough to receive it. That's why I think we need to at this point, I cited some data that said that I believe it was among the people who have not been vaccinated and never will be, they believe that the virus is worse than the vaccine.
Right.
I don't believe you're ever going to reach those people, and these people are keeping us from getting anywhere close to herd immunity. So again, I do not want the government going around and jabbing them in the arms. I do want to make the vaccine as widely available for those who want it or are on the fence about it, but have not, for whatever reason, gotten it. I'm totally fine with the with the door-to-door vaccination push, not intimidating people, not forcing anyone to do it, but making it highly available, and for private businesses to adopt policies that make it more difficult for the unvaccinated to spread the virus.
Right. I mean, you said in the piece, and I thought this was a point that I thought was really interesting, that you quoted Mark Levine, the local New York City Council member, and who said that we need mass solidarity or else it doesn't work. And your point is there is no solidarity right now. And that is the thing. I mean, there is no solidarity. And I think also the point, it's funny, I was reading something a couple months ago about having vaccine apps that could show if you're vaccinated or not. And one of the concerns, was back in April, was that you would have two Americas. You'd have a situation in which people who couldn't get access to the vaccine wouldn't be able to go to certain places. People who do access to vaccine can go there. And your point is, and I think exactly right, we do have two Americas right now. We have the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And right now, it seems to me that we are catering to the unvaccinated. In other words, the mask mandate in LA that just got imposed is because people are not vaccinated. And so everyone has to be vaccinated because we don't know who is and who is not vaccinated. Well, there is a way to know that, which is to demand proof of vaccination, which we haven't done. To my mind, this is a no-brainer, and I hear this argument, oh, it's a choice. I want to make the choice. I'm like, fine, you know what? Make a choice to put yourself in harm's way. That's your choice. But the rest of us have a choice too, and that is to not be around people who do that. And I was thinking about this because I wrote this piece My daughter, a couple days ago on Friday night, last Friday, so we're picking up dinner. We ordered dinner. We picked it up, and I said, "You have to come with us." Both my daughters come with me, and my oldest, I don't want to go. I said, "Okay, but we're going to pick up dessert also. So if you don't come, you're not going to get dessert." And she said, "That's fine. I don't want dessert." I said, "Okay, then you don't get dessert." And her younger sister, who then, by the way, taunted her the entire time with the dessert that she had, which is what younger children do. And my takeaway from this is that this is how we should deal with the vaccines. That you don't want to do this, that's your choice, but you're going to lose something for doing that. You're going to lose dessert. Maybe it's you lose going to a concert, you lose going to a restaurant, you lose going to a movie. Maybe that's what you lose, but there should be some consequence for not getting vaccinated.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually had the converse of that in the original draft, which was cut because it was a little sarcastic and the thing was running a little long. I believe in the free market. I'm not a fully lapsed libertarian. I'm more of an exiled libertarian. Okay. And I believe that if there is a market for non-vaccinated private businesses, if you want to be the bar that caters to the unvaccinated, go for it.
Sure.
You know, make a lot of money. You know, like make unvaccinated happy hours. You know, like prove that you have no antibodies and you get half off your drinks. But conversely, like it's not a perfect analogy, but like again, there was a time when I was against smoking bans because I was just like, it's a bar, it's a place it's to be disgusting, and it's a place of vice. But a convincing argument was, if you're smoking, I'm smoking.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
And if you are infected and you are breathing in the same indoor space I am, then I am now subject to viral loads that could get through my vaccination immunities. And why is the impetus on the person? Like why does the person who did the socially responsible thing, who is doing everything they can to resume life, why are they the ones that need to mask up again? Like, I mean, again, I'm arguing against both the government, like the Mark Levines who would say, they would just as they did in the early part of the pandemic, where it was just lockdown, we're all in this together. It's like you could do that once, you could do that for 2 months when we didn't know anything. Now we know a lot about the virus and its transmissibility. And to me, it just for people who won't believe that the virus works, who won't believe that it's not a Bill Gates mind control microchip, and they won't accept private businesses making their own policies, it feels like there's nothing that would move them. It feels like they're choosing to kind of create the other America. I don't love that there are two Americas, but there already is one.
Well, that's a question that I've been thinking a lot about. Is to what extent is this an issue in which people? So I know there are people out there who are never going to get the vaccine. I get that. But I kind of have a feeling there's a lot of people out there who could be convinced to get the vaccine. So, I think the interesting example that I thought, jumped out to me was that what I wrote about a little bit was the situation in France, which is, you mentioned this earlier. France announced last week that they're going to, say if you want to go to any public setting, you have to show proof of vaccination. And they had about a 40% vaccination rate at the time. About 3 million people within 72 hours signed up to get vaccinated online. So what I suspect is happening here to some extent is you have people who are hardcore not going to get vaccinated, and I think you have people who are kind of on the fence, who have believed the rhetoric of the anti-vaxxers, but who, under the right circumstances, could be convinced that they should do this. And the right circumstances, to me, are not to try to convince them, but to say to them, if you don't do this, you're going to lose something. I saw somebody on my Twitter feed made a great comment that their relative didn't want to get vaccinated, or their parents, and so they told them, if you want to see your grandkids, get vaccinated. Guess what? They got vaccinated. I do think that you can probably convince some people if you make it a mandate. But what I think has been frustrating, and you pick up on this point, is that the Biden administration has done a good job, I think, of getting the vaccines out there, distributing them, but they are tiptoeing around the elephant in the room, which is that they need to mandate it to some individuals. Now, for example, the military, a third of the military is not vaccinated. What the hell? I mean, Biden could order them tomorrow to get vaccinated. Federal employees are not required to be vaccinated. Why That makes no sense to me.
It's only because listen. It's only the reason, particularly military. The reason it's that they're not required to be vaccinated is because of the emergency use authorization. All the FDA has to do is get rid of that, and then it is required.
But I'll tell you, and I wrote a piece about this earlier in the week. What I have read says that if Biden orders military to vaccinate, they have to vaccinate.
Yeah,
it supersedes emergency authorization because it's happened a couple of years ago with the anthrax vaccine, and it wasn't authorized, but they still required people to get vaccinated. With federal employees, where's the issue here? You know, a private employer can say to their employees, you want to come and work in the office? Morgan Stanley did this, Goldman Sachs has done it. You have to be vaccinated. Not going to lose your job, but you have to be vaccinated. I don't understand why federal employees are not required to do the same thing. And I even read, you know, and I think I was seeing out in California that healthcare workers are not required to be vaccinated. This makes no sense to me.
I mean, like, so I'm going to a wedding soon that will be heavily populated by cops who in New York are very, very poorly vaccinated. I think 42% was the thing. And the thing is, cops are forward-facing public officials.
They are.
They are not people that don't engage with the public. I think it's outrageous that they're allowed to get out of this. But as I've written about many, many times, the police unions are one of the most powerful and destructive political forces in our country right now. They don't like reform and they don't like accountability. So it's not surprising that they'd be opposed to this. And unfortunately, as many public sector labor unions are, they're a political force. They are an explicitly conservative political force. They cater to and are catered, and Republican officials will cater to them. So what you're saying, like public schools and private schools both require inoculations. Private schools don't have to, but most do.
Right. Public schools, every state in the country, public schools require vaccination.
Yeah. So somebody had brought up the point that, like, well, maybe companies wouldn't require vaccinations if they were removed from liability. But it's like, if that's the case, then remove everybody from every liability in every workplace of all. I think one thing that I didn't quite have the ideas together to put it in the column, but for example, it's only been about 35 years that seatbelt laws were universally required. And there were a lot of holdouts to that, using the same arguments. And then eventually, after enough people went through windshields and then were not able to collect insurance on those car accidents, they changed their behavior. Right. Perhaps there's some kind of method, when it comes to insurance, because we do have this horrible third-party private insurance system in our country, where if you refuse to get the COVID vaccine and you don't have a compromised immune system or another good excuse to not take the vaccine, and you get COVID, then you're on the hook for your own medical bills.
That would certainly, you would think that would increase people's, that would diminish their reluctance, I would say.
Yeah.
I thought, I was also struck by the NFL announced this week that if games are teams cannot participate in games because they have COVID cases, they could be forced to forfeit the game as a loss.
Yeah.
Which I think is great. I think I don't know why the other leagues didn't do that. I was amazed to see, for example, that 100 Olympic athletes are not vaccinated, which I find frankly incomprehensible. That to me is the kind of way that you have to do this. And I guess it gets to a larger issue, and I'm curious if you think about this, that it does seem to be some element here where Democrats in particular seem afraid to, this administration in particular I'm talking about, afraid to take the tough steps necessary to mandate this, to force people to get, for example, ordering the military to get vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question is, is that, I get the politics of this, but I think to some extent, this just shows sort of the weakness of Democrats to sort of say, look, this is the way this needs to be. We need to put these mandates in place, requirements in place, and they're not willing to do it. And they're too afraid of political backlash.
Well, there would be a real political backlash, particularly if it came from the, again, public employees are different. Like, the courts have actually already determined that public employees have on the job far fewer free speech rights than private employees. All right. It's just it's one of the perks of the job, or like drags of the job, if you will, that, and people will often say, like, if you don't like it, get another job. London Breed in San Francisco is mandating that all public workers get vaccinated. and somebody pointed out, somebody, I forgot his name, sort of right of center Twitter guy, said, yeah, cops are going to do it because cops aren't going to lose their golden goose pensions, especially in California.
That's right.
To not get a jab, so it's one of those things where it's like incentives matter. And if people, if real hardcore libertarians and our narco capitalists don't want to accept that there already is, a certain form of pressure put on you by both private and public institutions, then they're just, it's fantasy, like you actually can be coerced into certain behaviors, like there are carve outs to, for religious exemptions, but when you take those religious exemptions, you don't get the same privileges. You can't send your kid to a public school not inoculated because you're a Christian Scientist. You need to go to a different school.
That's right. That's right. And I guess I just find it I think it's disappointing in some respects that, the administration is not willing to just follow through on the science on this and say we have to mandate this. So I think that, that is, I get the politics of it, but I think there's a, and I think you make this point in your piece that I think is important. There's a flip side to the politics of this, which is the politics of people who've been vaccinated, which is the majority of the country. And I think, if New York City reimposes a mask mandate, I'm going to be furious. I really am, because I'm going to feel very much as though, why am I being punished? Why am I being forced to change my behavior because other people are being selfish and irresponsible? And I'll do it because it's the law, and I'll do it, to protect people. But I'm going to be annoyed about it, frankly. And I think a lot of people will feel the same way. I think a lot of people will not do it. And I talked to a lot of people I've spoken to the last couple of days who are really angry over the fact that this is happening right now, that we're seeing this increase in cases, that we're seeing, these mandates being put in place at a time when, frankly, it shouldn't be happening because of the vaccines. So I there needs to be maybe a stronger backlash against the unvaccinated. I was struck by one thing, by the way, on that point. The governor of Alabama, Kay Ivey, yesterday, really went off on a reporter who said, how do you get people to vaccinate? She's like, I have no idea. What do you think? And, and her basic thing was like, they're being irresponsible. And they need more Republicans to say that. And I'm actually curious what your thought is on this. I have a theory on this that's not that complicated a theory. All of a sudden, Republicans are saying to people, get vaccinated. What do you think is going on here? Why are they doing that?
Well, one, they're not all doing it, but some of them.
That's true. That's a good point. They're not all doing it.
Yeah.
They're not all doing it.
Mitch McConnell and Steve, Mitch McConnell has always been, say what you want about Mitch, but Mitch McConnell has always been on the right side of this, and he's expressed even recently exasperation that he said something along the lines of, "I never believed we'd be in July 2021 with too many vaccines and not enough people to take them." He's like, "I never believed it would be there." And Steve, and
isn't it weird to say that Mitch McConnell is doing the right thing, but it's true in this situation?
Yeah, again, this is a little aside, but like to me, nobody gave a more stirring indictment of why Donald Trump was the most responsible person for the January 6th riot. Unfortunately, Mitch gave that speech after he voted to acquit. But he did give an absolutely stirring speach. But Steve Scalise also had been long a skeptic and made a big show of getting jabbed this week. So good for him. But there's still way too many laggards, and even you can tell that Fox News is getting a little worried about lawsuits or backlash or loss of advertisers. So they've had quite a few people going publicly encouraging people to get vaccinated, including Sean Hannity. But then Sean Hannity goes on his own radio show the next day and says, "No, I didn't mean it." There's I forget what the word is for that, but it's the kind of thing when it was used to describe Yasser Arafat when he would denounce terrorism in English and then say something else in Arabic. This is like Sean Hannity.
Two sides of your mouth, basically.
Yeah, Sean Hannity knows that his whatever he says on Fox News on the TV will be disseminated probably more broadly, but his radio audience is probably much more hardcore and in tune with his id and probably follows him much more intensely.
Yeah, so I think, part of me suspects that, I'll be honest with you, I suspect what happened here is they got some polling that showed that they were being blamed for the COVID spike. And they should be. They should be. There's no way around it. There have been a few responsible, some people have been responsible, but this goes back even further than the vaccines. And I recommended this. I mentioned this in the post I put out today. Monica Potts' piece in the Atlantic on what she is seeing. She lives in Arkansas on vaccine hesitancy, and I recommend everyone reading it. But she made a point that I really hadn't thought about that I think is really important, which is that this goes back to last year when Trump and a lot of Republican allies basically were spreading misinformation, but also disparaging people like Dr. Fauci. They were disparaging the medical professionals. They were, raising questions about the science, which meant that a year later, I think that kind of residual distrust is what's pushing a lot of this vaccine hesitancy, right? So if you were listening a year ago to Trump saying, or other people saying, don't trust Fauci, don't trust, the medical scientists, don't trust the healthcare professionals on this one, don't trust people, public health officials, it's not surprising a year later you still don't trust them. And I just think that this is a long-term process of disbelieving science, disbelieving expertise that is unfortunately endemic on the right that has led us to this point.
I mean, yeah, I would agree with that. I would also caution that, the CDC and the FDA made terrible mistakes, and there's definitely some evidence of institutional rot in both places. Fauci himself, I also think, has gotten a little bit of an easy ride when it comes to
a lot of an easy ride.
That none of that mattered then. Then it was just simultaneously in early 2020. Trump and his allies were basically trying to discredit all the institutions, even the ones that reported directly to him and had political appointees running them. He did the same exact thing with the elections. He was pushing election fraud before a single ballot had been cast, before the Democratic primary was even over.
Great point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So is it shocking that after he loses a fairly close election, when it comes down to it, I know electoral college wise it was wide, popular vote it was wide, but when it came down to it, much like 2016, it was just 10,000 votes here or there in a few counties in a few states.
Right.
Was the difference in the 2020 election. But the Trump voters had been told for months that there will be fraud. I mean, and frankly, Trump did the same thing in 2016. Basically, tried to
exactly
before the election was basically saying anything other than us winning is fraud. And even after he won, he was claiming there was fraud. He was claiming that there were boatloads or busloads of illegal immigrants going to New Hampshire, just making stuff up. And so he did the same thing in 2020, just as he was tearing down scientific institutions. And he is the most popular figure among the Republican base since Reagan, and I think he may even have more of a psychological hold on the base than Reagan. Reagan was kind of this father figure that even was for a time very popular among Democrats. He was very popular in the country. Trump was never popular among Democrats, and also Reagan. Reagan just kind of faded away once he left office. He had he had dementia. Trump and Trumpism has a whole cult around it. There are plenty of personalities pushing Trumpism as opposed to whatever mainstream conservative might be in the absence of Trump.
Right.
Whereas, Reagan was succeeded by Bush. He was succeeded by a more moderate version of himself, so it's there wasn't a divide between Reaganism and mainstream Republicanism. Now, if there is something that can be called mainstream Republicanism, if it's embodied by somebody like Mitch McConnell, Trump still wins. Trump runs the show.
That's exactly right. And Liz Cheney can certainly back up that notion. I want to get to this, to something you wrote about a couple of days, we tweeted about a few years ago, but I did want to mention Ron Irving he put up this tweet from a player for the Buffalo Bills who says, who basically said that improving the COVID was made in a lab. Fauci also part of Pfizer. That's why people don't want to get the vaccine. I am really struck when I see this from this DeAndre Hopkins yesterday, who's a wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals, said he might retire rather than get the vaccine, being forced to get the vaccine. I have to just point out that the player that Ron mentioned, John Feliciano for the Bills, and DeAndre Hopkins play a game that there's a reasonable chance that they will suffer brain damage from playing that game. And they are complaining about taking a vaccine that will save their lives. I don't understand it.
Yeah, but did you ever see the Shaquille O'Neal meme where he's like, I sleep, and then there's another one where he's his head is exploding.
Yeah.
Somebody did that where it's CTE, I sleep. vaccines that are 98% effective. Head explodes.
It's a bit incomprehensible. And I'll just say one last point about this. I think it's sort of interesting. There was a clip on CBS News. You can find it on Twitter or Google it, of a man who's in the hospital bed, recovering from COVID, saying that he still wouldn't get vaccinated, and even knowing that the vaccine would have kept him from getting sick, he still wouldn't have taken it. And I think that is something about, and that's something you say, I think, with a lot of Trump supporters, that once you sort of go in, you can't admit that you're wrong. And so the stubbornness of, I've gone this far, I can't back down now. I think there's a certain narcissism of people who don't want to admit they were wrong, who don't want to admit the vaccine worked. And so they're not going to do it. I will, by the way, I was also struck with the fact that the person who spoke, it was interviewed before this man who wouldn't get the vaccine, was a woman who said she would get the vaccine, but she said her job was a pharmaceutical researcher and she didn't get vaccinated. So I give up. Anyway, but this gets to a point, something you tweeted about the other day, and I put the tweet in the chat at the top of the page. You talked about post-Trump libertarianism has now devolved into a shrinking cult catering to anti-vaxxers, voter fraud, dead enders, and cloud-chasing grifters. And you mentioned the keynote speakers at the Freedomfest this week, which includes the James O'Keefe, who's a noted prevaricator, Dave Rubin, who I know you have a lot of issues with, and Naomi Wolf, who I think is kind of nuts, and someone named Monica Perez, I don't really know her very well. So can you talk a little bit about what is happening on the post-Trump libertarian wing?
Yeah. So, again, some disclosure. When forced to self-identify, I always try to not, because I have heterodox politics. I carry no water for either major party or either major orthodoxy, whether it's liberal or conservative. So on the American scale of politics, I've always kind of had to slide into libertarianism. And if forced to self-describe what kind of politics are most important to me, I would still say civil libertarianism. So in my 6 or 7 years or so working in libertarian journalism, primarily for Reason, I mostly worked on criminal justice stuff, drug stuff, police brutality, free speech. I didn't write about taxes. I didn't write about how Ayn Rand books are good and that the poor are leeches, which always put me a bit out of step with the hardcore readership at Reason, and probably limited my growth in the company. But I had some success as a criminal justice reporter. I was able to break stories and even get policies changed. I was passionate about it, and really, it felt like at that time in the mid 2010s that only the libertarian audience would have allowed me the space to do that. There's a handful of people who are on the libertarian spectrum that write for mainstream publications who were covering that stuff, but few. So I always appreciated the libertarian movement for being able to be the kind of movement that is okay being kind of friends with anyone who wants to be a worthy ally, and will also criticize anyone, including their own allies. That was what I believed it to be. During the rise of Trump, I saw increasing reticence among editors in that world to come down on Trump too harshly, or at least come down on Trump and violence at Trump rallies. And calling them for what they were. It was often said to me explicitly that this is a distraction. We should be talking about policy. We think, oh, this is a mainstream media distraction. The quasi-fascist stuff going on at Trump rallies. Not something we need to worry about. Which I delighted in recounting those stories during the insurrection. That this was all a distraction. 5 years ago, it was a distraction. Right. So during the Trump era. I left Reason very early on in the Trump era, and went my own path. Still in my mind, pretty much keeping my politics the same. I didn't really. I know some ex-libertarians have just thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They want nothing to do with it. They're ashamed of their past. I'm not ashamed of anything I wrote or did. I felt like I called bullshit wherever it needed to be called, and that's what I'm doing now. If even if I'm not a libertarian in good standing, I still feel like I'm kind of calling balls and strikes on what is the closest thing to my team, and I believe that. To take us back to the original tweet that got us into this conversation, Freedomfest is an annual gathering of libertarians and conservatives, mostly libertarians. It's in the 10 or 11 years I've been aware of it. It's an annual thing. It's advertised like crazy in Reason magazine and on the website. Reason always does a bunch of events. They have an entire day devoted to them there. There's always video interviews popping out of there. So in my opinion, it's one of the bellwethers of mainstream libertarianism, even if they've often had kind of crank conservatives also speaking there, like
Right.
in 2015, Donald Trump, Dinesh D'Souza at certain points. What I'm arguing is different here is that the level of like scumbag grifters that are like rising to star, like celebrity ally status, who are some of the keynote speakers at this thing, they cannot be waved away in any honest fashion. If you're an honest libertarian, you cannot say that's not real libertarianism. That's just Freedomfest is weird. What are you going to do? It's like, no, these are the same people who are
This is what
often,
libertarianism has become, is what you're saying, basically.
yeah, like mainstream libertarians engage with these people. They will be interviewed favorably in libertarian publications. There is no divide, and if there were, then really, if you're a brave tribalist libertarian, it is on you to call them out. It is on you to say, I'm embarrassed to be appearing. I'm going to be appearing at Freedomfest, but I'm really embarrassed to be appearing with this person here and these other 6 people here.
Right.
But they won't do that. It's a go along, get along kind of thing, because those people are bigger than them. The grifters are bigger than the honest libertarians, so they don't dare bite the hand that feeds them. And one thing that's important to note about libertarianism, I shouldn't say libertarianism because that's a philosophy, but what is known as the liberty movement in this country has about 3 think tanks and 1 publication, and they're all generally funded by the same billionaires and a few trusts.
Right.
And those are the people you don't offend. If they like you, you'll go far in that game. If you don't, like my former colleague Shikha Dalmia, who used to write for Reason and The Week, she wrote stridently against Donald Trump's racist anti-immigration policies, and her beat at the Reason Foundation was immigration. She's an Indian American immigrant who wrote about immigration, and they loved her for that when she was writing about Obama's mass deportations. But once she started getting too mean to Trump, she was out of a job.
But let me ask you a question about this, because this gets to something that I think is interesting that's happened in the last couple of years, and I'll use the example of the evangelical movement. So one of the assumptions people had, I think, back in 2015 and 2016 was that Trump wouldn't play with evangelicals because he doesn't exactly embody evangelical values, or stated values, I should say. He's been divorced 3 times. He's been on the cover of Playboy magazine. I mean, he's a libertine. I think we might argue. And so there's an expectation that he wouldn't play with that group. And in reality, they are his base. They're his biggest supporters are evangelicals, which suggested to me and to others that evangelicals were really not that focused on values. They're much more focused on partisanship, and that the values, in a sense, became a way of expressing their partisanship. And so that evangelicals were so willing to basically put aside their stated values and the claims that got them involved in politics to support somebody who really didn't embody those values, would suggest that really what motivated them was what motivates everyone else, it seems, in American society today: partisanship.
Well, I would say I don't know that sometimes partisanship, I would say, is just like, I'm going to do the opposite of what my enemy does. I think Trump delivered policy-wise for evangelicals, with judgeships. I think that's what they more appreciated, and why they're so loyal to him, is that, yes, they absolutely sold out their stated values when they claimed that Bill Clinton was Satan incarnate because of his lack of morality, but Trump whatever. And the difference is that Trump made certain political promises and said he would pack as many
That's fair.
judges, and he delivered.
But that's fair. I guess there does seem to be an element of hypocrisy, though, particularly during the campaign, when many of them supported Trump. He was not president yet. This is 2015, 2016. Even though, again, he did not seem to embody the values they seem to care about. So I guess, but putting that aside, we can disagree maybe how much of that was based on judges, how much it was based on partisanship. Do you think a similar thing may have happened, similar to what my example is, to libertarians, that partisanship overwhelmed some of their ideological beliefs?
This is where I got to stop though, because I don't like when my tweet was critical of the liberty movement, which I think so like there are plenty of honest libertarians. There are plenty of people like me who don't feel like they've changed, but feel like they've been, whatever the libertarian cool kids are, we're not them, the liberty movement is always been one that has trended right, primarily because of their, steadfast support of free markets, which is just not something the Democrats are going to get into. Like for whatever reason, during the Reagan Revolution, the libertarian, peg of the big tent, found some influence in the Republican Party. It never had that influence in the Democratic Party. So it's always going to trend a little right. But what disappointed me is that that so many libertarians either went into kind of a disingenuous apologia for Trump, which is basically just kind of putting themselves into a anti-Trump position, like, oh, LOL the snowflakes, LOL MSNBC and Joy Reid, without like making meaningful critiques of the horrible shit that Trump would do on a regular basis. That's one level of it. And the other level is the sadder level, in my opinion, which is that a lot of libertarians who were kind of teetering on the brink of becoming far-right populists, the Trump revolution was what tipped them over to that, that where they really did, like there are people that claim to be libertarians that I sometimes get into tussles with who fully support laws banning critical race theory in school. And even so, as someone who's got criticisms of critical race theory and also has criticisms of certain anti-racist philosophies being taught in public schools, I think there's a conversation to be had there. I don't know how you call yourself a libertarian and say, I want a broadly written ban on divisive issues. And yet that is something that is being pushed by Republicans all over this country and being supported by a lot of people who call themselves libertarians. That's when I go, whoa, like with friends like these, who needs friends?
Well, can I ask you, I'm actually curious about something. Do you think, and I mean, as somebody with, sort of libertarian leanings, do you find, for you at least, did the pandemic and the responses to it make you question some of your libertarian beliefs?
Well, yes, and so here's the thing. Like I said, on economics, like, would I say that regulation is the first thing I think the government should be thinking about? No, right. I think whenever possible, like, have a light touch, but that doesn't mean even micro anarchism. It means just like, don't pass stupid regulations. Like I don't think that you should take 500 hours of training to be able to braid hair, stuff like that.
Okay. That's fair.
But yeah, I mean, I like. And it's funny, somebody made a point that like the government response to the pandemic was both an indictment of libertarianism and an endorsement of libertarianism, because clearly we need public works, clearly we need functioning institutions, and clearly some of these institutions failed us, and had they gotten out of the way, we would have been in a better shot. Like the FDA and the CDC kept us from getting working tests that were available. Like that was a level of bureaucracy that slowed down what the free market could have taken care of. So it's not an either or answer to your question, but I will say overall, I'm less convinced in the power of the free market to solve all things and to do it without bloodshed.
But I think it's more about the question of government mandates. I mean, I think, you saw this last year when people didn't want to wear masks. Let's maybe put a face on this. I wrote something a couple weeks ago about Kristi Noem up in South Dakota, who is just a loathsome individual, in my opinion. I'm sorry to say that, but I think
just spoke at Freedomfest today too.
They're perfect. Yeah, exactly. So Kristi Noem, basically refused to issue a mask mandate in South Dakota. She refused to wear a mask in public to model, good behavior. She consistently what's it called? I should say, questioned the need for social distancing, all these kind of things. And of course, South Dakota had one of the worst outbreaks of COVID in the country. Mm-hmm. And her argument has been people need to show personal responsibility. And I hate this argument, because personal No, they don't actually, because personal responsibility does not solve a pandemic. This is actually when you need the government to say, this is your responsibility, this is what you have to do, and we're going to require you to do it. That's why you have governments. You have governments because situations like pandemics, because you cannot rely on 320 million people all making the right decision. You can't. We know that. I mean, if you know people, you know that's true. Okay.
We have stop signs and traffic lights and rules about driving on the right side of the road because we can't trust everyone to drive safely on the left side of the road.
Exactly. And so I find it just so disturbing when I hear people make this argument about, oh, we have to rely on personal responsibility. No, that doesn't work. And if you think you're not going to get sick from COVID, you're not going to wear a mask, fine, but you're going to get somebody else sick. If you don't think you have to get vaccinated because it's your personal choice, fine. But you know what's going to happen? You get somebody else sick. You're going to run up healthcare costs, and you make it harder for the rest of us to actually have a post-pandemic life. So I find, to me, the biggest rejection of libertarianism, of this idea that you don't need government. The government, shouldn't get in the way. I mean, I'll take the point. I like regulation. I'll take your point that there are, obviously excesses and things that I've criticized too. But, if you can't understand why you need a strong government, if the last year didn't prove that to you, I don't know what will. Because really, the half the reason, a good part of the reason why people died in this country is because we didn't have a strong government. We didn't have people who were actually willing to listen to the government when it came to, public health issues. That's how we got to the place we are today. I hate to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, that's the thing is, even at my most libertarian, I never was the type of person that felt like the government inherently did everything wrong or it was inherently unnecessary. I mean, I would always just kind of advocate for smart government. Like, don't, like there are like, just to give you one example, most of the sex crime registry laws in this country are terrible. They were all passed in panic. They're usually named after a dead child, and they almost all include statutes that make 16-year-olds who had 15-year-old girlfriends sign up for sex offender registries for life. That's bad government, and there's a lot of that. It should be watched. It's not an indictment for the idea of government. It's not an indictment, of the fact that, like, particularly if there was ever a need for government, it's in a case of war. It's in a case of national emergency. This is as close as you could get to both. All right. I mean, this is
of course.
Yeah.
But you still had people, even during this moment of national emergency, who still were adhering to this idea that I want the government telling me what to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's a very American kind of a thing. I think it's very much part of our culture, not a culture that I personally relate to. But I think there is this notion that, like, the government shouldn't tell me what to do. I mean, look, if I had my way, government would be way more involved in people's lives than they are. I mean, we disagree on this point. But I'm a big fan of the Nanny State, and I like to see more of it, because if there's one thing we've learned over the years, I've learned in 50 years, is that you cannot trust people to make the right decision. That includes me, by the way. I'm putting myself in this category as well. You need someone who's smarter, someone who understands, what's best for everybody, to sort of be the arbiter of that. So last thing I did was, somebody asked a question of the libertarian reaction to January 6th, and I'm assuming that this again went along partisan lines. You obviously, I assume, I don't know if we discussed this, but I think you were not a big fan of the insurrection.
No, I didn't support it.
No. Okay, good to know. Good to know. I didn't think so. Yeah. And I also, but is this a situation in which the liberty movement people, the people organizing Freedomfest, are they going to find some reason to support, or at least not condemn what happened on January 6th?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would encourage anyone to go right now to the Freedomfest website and look at the roster of, or the schedule, all the breakout rooms. There isn't one about the insurrection. There isn't one about voter fraud conspiracy theories. There isn't one saying, hey, how does the right move on from this asinine conspiracy theory that's completely made up? How do we rid ourselves of the stink of Trump's lies. How do we do that? Nothing like that on there. A million things on like, Biden and tech policy and stuff like that. So to me, like that gives up the game, that if you're not going to make it a policy to like clean up the crap in your own backyard, then you're a hack, that you're just afraid of offending the people who might be fellow travelers on like one or two issues, or the people who keep your lights on. That's it. Don't pretend that you have any principles or that, you're tribeless in any way. You clearly have a tribe. But to be very clear, plenty of libertarians, plenty of prominent libertarians were absolutely disgusted and outraged by the January 6th riots. It is not the mainstream libertarian point of view that they were good or that voter fraud was a thing. Like I said, unfortunately, I think that there's too much of a tendency to downplay how destructive both things were for democracy and continue to be for democracy. But for lack of a better phrase, the good libertarians were unequivocally repulsed by this thing. But unfortunately, there are a lot of like internet celebrities, internet personalities, YouTube stars, people with their own, Patreon type things, who would either like maybe out of one side of their mouth go, well, of course I'm against the January 6th thing, but also it was Antifa, and also it was the FBI, and also they thought they were invited, and also they were just being patriots expressing their grievances, like whatever they could throw at the wall to make excuses for it. There's a lot of that.
Yeah, I think there's some element of whataboutism on that for sure. So somebody asked also, any well-known libertarians denounced Trumpism publicly, and I feel like Reason has been pretty harsh on Trump. Am I right?
I mean, I don't know that I like Reason's they've been critical of Trump. Like, there's no question about it. There are a couple of personalities there that have definitely like played footsie and flirted with Trumpism, or like I said, have always kind of taken a more anti-Trump posture. But when it comes to like, policy, Peter Suderman's been all over them, all over the Trump administration. CJ Charmella is, great criminal justice reporter that they've got there. I think mainstream, like, particularly at Reason and Cato and IHS, there's been a lot of criticisms of Trump. But that's the thing is, when the liberty movement as we know it, as kind of like both a political force and sort of, I guess, the way like a media of presence, isn't just Reason and the think tanks. It's also these kind of like edgelord douchebags who like will, have Alex Jones on their show because they think it's funny, like that like stuff like that. And unfortunately, a lot of those people have audiences just as big or bigger than the mainstream libertarians, and therefore they're I think that's part of why the whole Freedomfest thing is happening. I know, like, some libertarians might wave it away and be like, that's not real libertarianism. But it's like, if that's where the audience is and that's where the donors are, then it is. That is where libertarianism is right now.
I want to get, we have to finish up soon, but I want to get to that point, because I think it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, that, you mentioned earlier, you have sort of heterodox views, and I kind of do too. I mean, I'm not afraid or unwilling to criticize Democrats or criticize policies I don't like. And I, sometimes get crap from that, for saying that, from people on the political left. Mm-hmm. And that's normal. I mean, that's just part of the game, in your opinion.
Healthy.
Right? It's healthy, exactly. It's not healthy when they call you names and issue death threats, which I get occasionally. But all right, it's part of the drill. I get it. But do you think that it's harder to be a heterodox thinker these days? That both sides, and I hate both sidesism, but we'll just go for it in this example, that both left and right are less accepting of viewpoints that even slightly deviate from sort of accepted norm on the left and the right?
I think there's no question about it. Like, for example, like, look at my mentions, on any given week. If I write critically about Joe Biden, which I do often, I'm, accused of being like a neoliberal or a libertarian. Right. And if I write critically of Trump or Trumpism or vaccine skeptics, then I'm a fascist. It's weird how they've like kind of adopted that now. But yeah,
all bases are covered with you, apparently.
It's why I used to do a lot more media hits, and now I don't. And not because I wouldn't if I was asked, but because I was a cable TV producer for about a year. I did my best to sneak heterodox voices in, but in general, on TV, cable news, and on radio shows, that you've got to be team blue or team red. You know, you need to be advocating for, you might be able to throw a wacky opinion in here or there, but you certainly cannot challenge the orthodoxy. And so I've even made myself less TV marketable by also kind of refusing to be pigeonholed into a sort of libertarian tribalistic posture. So, you know, and that's the thing is the certainly the big factions of liberal and conservative media do not want to hear heterodox thoughts, but unfortunately, in the middle, in the centrist and libertarian worlds, there are also do's and don'ts that'll get you kicked out of the club.
That's right. And I look, I think it's I think it's always been this way to some extent. And I think also, for the record, I think things like social media definitely subvert our understanding of what is. I mean, the people who gravitate to social media, except for us, of course, except for journalists, tend to be very extreme in their views, and they tend to express them very openly and in a way that suggests that they're not very open to different points of view. And I think, one thing I'll say about Joe Biden, I have some criticisms of the way he handled things as well. But one thing I will say about him that I give him a lot of credit for is he and his White House basically ignore social media, ignore Twitter. They don't take it seriously. I always felt like some Democratic candidates in 2016 paid attention to Twitter, the Biden people did not. It's not real life. But I do think that it does get more difficult to express views that really kind of go outside of the norm. And I mean, I think a friend of ours who I think we can relate to this is Jesse Singal, is a good friend of both of ours, who is somebody who's sort of written some sort of heterodox views on issue of trans rights, on cancel culture, and he gets more abuse than anybody I've ever seen, frankly.
Absolutely. I think it's a fantastic example. And as I've explained to people, because as you know, like Jesse's name's been unfairly disparaged for years, and to the point where like narratives have been put in place, and like people who I know, people who are journalists, people who should know better than to just like take somebody's word about something, especially if they're saying something awful about a person without like doing their homework, have said to me, blithely, like, "Oh, Jesse Singal is obviously a transphobe," and I'll say,
"Yes,
why? What did he do?" And well, I read this Jezebel article. What in the Jezebel? Like, they can never actually point to the thing. His sin, as we know, was taking a heterodox position. The article
heterodox, really.
Yeah, the article he wrote about the detransitioning trans people was like thoroughly reported in a mainstream liberal publication, The Atlantic. It had tons of editors, it had tons of fact checkers, it had tons of sources, and all he did was write about it. Like, I didn't even see a take in that thing, but that one piece of work led to several blog posts calling him the worst human being on the planet, and that's all anyone remembers. Nobody actually like goes back to like, patient zero of this accusation and has parsed it out themselves. So I think that's a fantastic example of the dangers of taking a heterodox position. Forget about even taking a heterodox position, but like poking at a third rail, like just like without even probably at the time didn't even know it was a third rail. Who knew that like you literally could not even explore this thing that is an actual thing.
And I had this experience over a couple of days ago where we were talking about the January 6th commission and the fact that that Nancy Pelosi basically kicked Jim Jordan and Jim Banks from Indiana off of the committee, and then McCarthy pulled all the Republican members from the committee, which was predictable. And someone pointed out this was a gift to McCarthy, and it is. I mean, it's a simple piece of political analysis to say this is actually what he wanted. He was playing a pretty crappy hand, but the best he could hope for was for Nancy Pelosi to made her look partisan, which would further the Republican argument that this is a partisan investigation. And that happened. Doesn't mean she wasn't right to do it. Doesn't mean that he's not a hypocrite. Doesn't mean that he's not acting in a way that's completely disingenuous. Of course, that's true. But from a political analysis standpoint, I can still say that's probably the best thing that could have happened to him. I got pilloried for saying this because as if I'm making a value judgment about it. And I try to explain to people, like, my job, among other things, is to analyze politics. And sometimes that means coming up with a viewpoint about politics that is different from what I believe, different from what I think should occur, but that recognizes the political impact of a certain decision. And that idea seems to be forbidden. And I notice this a lot, that a lot of people and I don't want to say the left, because I don't want to generalize, but there is this notion that if you express an opinion, if you just point something out about something on the right, like what the motivation is for Republicans to, for example, oppose January 6th investigation, it's somehow seen as not analysis, but like you're agreeing with it.
Yeah.
And you can't even express the opinion.
Mhm.
And I find that really objectionable because that's not what I do, right? I mean, we are smart people, so we have a smart species. We can point out that the political benefits of this are clear for McCarthy, even if I can argue it's disingenuous and wrong. I can point out, as I did, I wrote a book on 1968, that Richard Nixon played on racial fears with his law and order campaign. That can be wrong, can also be a correct political strategy.
Yeah.
And there is this notion now that you can't sort of make those kinds of devalued judgments, if you know what I mean, like judgments that are just sort of that look at like the from in a vacuum, or look at it not from the perspective of what should happen, but what did happen, or from an analysis standpoint.
Yeah, I think one quick point is that, and you probably heard about this story, last summer during the widespread police brutality protests that some turned into riots. There was a progressive data analyst named Daniel Shore, who's pretty well known in liberal data circles.
He's by the way, just a brilliant guy, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, and so all he did was tweet a study produced by a Black professor at Princeton University, which used data to come to the conclusion that riots help Republicans get elected. That's it. That's it. All he did was tweet the data by the study, and that cost him his job at a progressive analytics firm.
And I want to point out, by the way, that I made the exact same point on my Twitter feed, that if you look at the history of the 1960s, the political protests did not actually boomeranged against the civil rights movement. It's not even a controversial argument, really. And you're right, it cost him his job because people didn't want to hear that. People didn't want to hear. And the other example of this, I think, that I find so objectionable was, the Tom Cotton op-ed in the New York Times, where he called for sending the military into the streets. Now, I did not agree with him. I thought it was a shitty op-ed, frankly, and shoddily written, and should have been edited better than it was. That was my problem with it. But the argument itself is legitimate to raise New York Times because the president himself had brought the issue up. And, I think it should be rejected wholeheartedly, but I don't disagree with the idea the Times can put it out there and then allow people to hack at it, which they should have. I
mean, particularly when 6 months later, a mainstream liberal argument was massive amounts of troops in Washington, D.C. to, I agree with that. I mean, again, the op-ed was garbage. It seems that the process that it went through was haphazard. It seems like a young editor got thrown under the bus for the process. That's another conversation. But the idea that a United States senator, as you said, expressing the ideas that not only the president was saying, but several Republicans in Congress were saying, that should not be published in the New York Times. What benefit does that serve? Like, it's still in the U.S. Senate.
You had people at the Times who literally tweeted out, "I feel in danger because of this piece," and that's crazy. I
believe that it was a lot of journalists saying this op-ed puts Black New York Times reporters in danger. I think they were all repeating the same. And you know what? As a free speech person, I believe in the right of response. If you want to band together and make the exact same statement as a form of protest, that's fine. What I didn't think was the right thing to do was to flay everyone involved, to the point that they lost their jobs. I don't think again. Private businesses can decide that an employee is not worth the hassle anymore. I just think that in certain cases, the bar has gotten too low, and it fluctuates wildly as to what is a fireable offense.
Agreed. And I just think that we look, and I understand people being upset about the piece. I was upset about the piece, but I think that we should not. I will continue to believe that sunshine is always the best disinfectant, that it's better to put ideas, even bad ideas, out in public domain to be discussed and to be dismissed if they should be dismissed, or to be celebrated as you celebrated. One of which, of course, was your piece today on vaccine mandate. This is why I had you on. But we need to finish up. This was a fantastic conversation. You have to come on again because this is great. I do want to make one point that Lauren Mackett tweeted out, put on the chat, that Ron Klain tweeted an hour ago that vaccine rates were up 14% from last week. She's right, step in the right direction. I'm so glad to hear that. Hopefully that will continue. If you're, I'm sure everyone on this who's listening to this has been vaccinated. If you're not, get vaccinated. And if you have friends or relatives, tell them to get vaccinated, because it will save their life. But thank you for coming, Anthony, and thank you for everyone who joined us today. It's a pleasure, and I will see you next Friday. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye. Okay, I think we're done. All right, thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next week.